The word caveman conjures up images that are almost entirely wrong. You picture some grunting, club-wielding brute, dragging a woman by her hair, living in dank caves surrounded by nothing but darkness and danger. But here's the thing that will completely shatter everything you think you know about our ancestors. They weren't alone. Not even close. What if I told you that the humans living 40,000 years ago had better relationships with animals than most of us do today? What if the so-called primitive world was actually a thriving ecosystem of cooperation, partnership, and mutual survival that makes our modern pet ownership look shallow by comparison? Tonight, we're diving deep into the forgotten world of Ice Age companionship. We're talking about the creatures that shared fires with our ancestors, the animals that helped them survive the harshest conditions Earth has ever thrown at humanity, and the partnerships that literally shaped what it means to be human. This isn't just about dogs, though we'll get to that mind-blowing story. We're talking about horses that carried humans across frozen continents, birds that guided them to food, massive predators that somehow became allies, and relationships so complex that archaeologists are still piecing together the evidence from bones scattered across ancient campsites. But here's where it gets really interesting. The animals that lived alongside our ancestors weren't just surviving in the same space. They were actively choosing to be there. These weren't pets in the way we understand them today. These were partnerships forged in ice and fire, tested by mammoth hunts and endless winters. Relationships that meant the difference between extinction and survival. And the evidence we're about to explore will completely change how you think about intelligence, cooperation, and what it really means to be wild. Because it turns out, the line between human and animal, between civilization and nature, was never as clear as we've been taught. So settle in, because we're about to journey back to a time when humans and animals didn't just coexist. They thrived together. And what happened in those ancient partnerships echoes in every relationship we have with animals today. The first shock comes from Germany. Deep in a cave system called Schöningen, archaeologists uncovered something that shouldn't exist: wooden spears, perfectly preserved, dating back 300,000 years. But these weren't crude sticks sharpened with stones. These were engineered hunting weapons, balanced for throwing, crafted with an understanding of aerodynamics that would make a modern javelin coach proud. But here's the part that changes everything. Scattered around those spears were bones, not human bones, animal bones. But not the bones of prey animals lying where they fell. These bones tell a different story entirely. Horse bones, arranged deliberately. Some showing cut marks that suggest careful butchering. Yes, but others showing something else. Evidence of long-term interaction. Evidence of animals that lived alongside humans for extended periods before they died. And then there are the wolf bones. Wolf bones that show no signs of violence, no evidence of hunting. Wolf bones that appear in human campsites across Europe, Asia, and eventually the Americas, spanning tens of thousands of years. These aren't the bones of enemies. These are the bones of something else entirely. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because to understand how animals became partners with our ancestors, we need to understand what the world actually looked like back then. And it was nothing like the world you imagine. Forget everything you think you know about the Ice Age. This wasn't a barren, lifeless wasteland of snow and ice. This was a planet teeming with life, unlike anything we see today. Picture grasslands stretching to every horizon, filled with herds of animals so vast they darkened the landscape. Woolly mammoths the size of small buildings, cave lions that could take down those mammoths, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, and dire wolves that made modern wolves look like house cats. This was a world where a single misstep meant death, where the wrong decision about which path to take could lead your entire family into the territory of a cave bear or a pack of hyenas. Survival wasn't just difficult, it was mathematically improbable. And yet humans not only survived in this world, they thrived. They spread across continents, adapted to environments from tropical forests to Arctic tundra, and somehow managed to outlast creatures that were bigger, stronger, and better adapted to the harsh conditions. How did they do it? The answer isn't tools, though tools helped. It isn't fire, though fire was crucial. The answer is partnership, alliance, the ability to form relationships with other species that benefited everyone involved. And the evidence for these partnerships is written in the archaeological record in ways that will blow your mind. Let's start with the obvious one, the partnership that everyone knows about but completely misunderstands: dogs. Or rather, the creatures that would become dogs. Because what happened between humans and wolves 40,000 years ago wasn't domestication as we think of it today. It was something far stranger and more beautiful. The traditional story goes like this. Humans found wolf puppies, raised them, and gradually bred them into dogs over thousands of years. Nice story. Completely wrong. The real story begins with a mystery that archaeologists call the wolf paradox. Starting around 40,000 years ago, wolf bones begin appearing in human campsites across Europe. Not just one or two bones, hundreds of them, thousands of them. Wolves that lived alongside humans, died alongside humans, and were buried alongside humans with the same care given to human family members. But here's the thing that doesn't make sense. These weren't small, domesticated animals. These were full-size wolves, genetically identical to the wild wolves roaming the forests. No selective breeding, no human control, no leashes or cages, or any evidence that humans were keeping these animals against their will. So what were they doing there? The answer comes from understanding what life was actually like for both species. Humans were nomadic, following herds of prey animals across vast distances. They lived in small groups, maybe 20 or 30 individuals, constantly moving, constantly searching for food. Wolves lived the same way. Same prey animals, same territories, same challenges. And here's where it gets interesting. Both species had something the other needed. Humans had fire, tools, and the ability to plan complex hunting strategies. They could track wounded animals for days, set traps, and coordinate attacks on prey much larger than themselves. But humans were slow, had poor hearing, and couldn't hunt effectively in the dark. Wolves had speed, incredible senses, and the ability to pursue prey for miles without tiring. They could detect danger long before humans knew it existed, and they were lethal hunters in conditions where humans struggled. But wolves couldn't make fire, couldn't craft tools, and couldn't process meat and hides the way humans could. The partnership wasn't one species domesticating another. It was two species recognizing that they were better together than apart. And the evidence for this partnership goes far beyond bones. It's written in the DNA of modern dogs, in the archaeological record of ancient campsites, and in the behavior of both species that persists to this day. Modern wolves, when raised alongside humans from birth, don't become dogs. They remain wolves, with all the behavioral patterns that makes them unsuitable as pets. But something remarkable happens when you observe wild wolves and humans in the same territory. They begin to coordinate, not through training or domestication, but through mutual recognition of shared interests. There are documented cases in places like Yellowstone National Park, where wild wolves have been observed following human hunters, scavenging from their kills, and even leading humans to wounded prey. No one trained them to do this. No one domesticated them. They simply recognized an opportunity for mutual benefit and acted on it. Now imagine that same recognition happening 40,000 years ago. But instead of occasional encounters, it's daily life. Humans and wolves following the same herds, camping in the same areas, facing the same predators. Over time, the most cooperative wolves would have had better access to food. The most cooperative humans would have had better protection and hunting success. This wasn't domestication. This was co-evolution. Two species changing each other through partnership rather than dominance. And the changes show up in the archaeological record in ways that are absolutely stunning. Wolf bones from 35,000 years ago show subtle differences from their wild counterparts. Not the dramatic changes we see in modern dog breeds, but small shifts in skull shape, tooth size, and bone density that suggest these animals were eating different food, living different lifestyles, and experiencing different selective pressures than their wild relatives. But the most remarkable evidence comes from the humans themselves. Because as wolves were changing, so were the people who lived alongside them. Human campsites from this period show evidence of more sophisticated hunting strategies, longer distance travel, and successful colonization of environments that would have been impossible for humans alone. The spread of humans into Arctic regions, across the Bering Land Bridge into North America, and into the high-altitude environments of Central Asia all coincide with evidence of human-wolf partnerships. These weren't just companions. They were the key to human expansion across the planet. But wolves weren't the only animals forming these partnerships. Because once you know what to look for, the evidence of human-animal cooperation in the Ice Age is everywhere. Take horses, for example. Most people think of horses as something humans domesticated much later, maybe 6,000 years ago in the steppes of Central Asia. But horse bones appear in human campsites, going back much further than that. And not just as food sources. In sites across Europe and Asia, archaeologists have found horse bones that show evidence of wear patterns consistent with carrying loads, not riding necessarily, but pack animals, horses that lived alongside humans, carried their belongings, and died natural deaths rather than being hunted. The relationship makes perfect sense when you think about it. Horses are herd animals that follow predictable migration routes. Humans following those same routes would naturally encounter the same herds repeatedly. And horses, unlike many other large mammals, are relatively calm around humans if approached correctly. A partnership with horses would have given Ice Age humans incredible advantages. Faster travel across long distances, the ability to carry more supplies and tools, access to areas that would have been impossible to reach on foot. And the evidence suggests this partnership was far more common than anyone previously imagined. The evidence becomes even more intriguing when we look at what archaeologists call associated remains. These are animal bones found in human sites that tell stories of relationships lasting not days or weeks, but years. At a site called Dolní Věstonice, in what is now the Czech Republic, researchers discovered something that rewrote the entire textbook on Ice Age life. Mammoth bones, yes, but arranged in patterns that suggest these massive animals weren't just hunted. They were managed, guided, perhaps even herded. The bones show cut marks consistent with butchering, but they also show something else entirely. Wear patterns on the tusks that suggest these mammoths were used for moving heavy objects. Modifications to the bones that indicate they served as construction materials while the animals were still alive. Evidence that these creatures lived in proximity to humans for extended periods. Think about what this means. We're talking about animals that weighed as much as modern elephants, with tusks that could impale a human without effort, living peacefully alongside our ancestors. This isn't domination through force. This is negotiation, agreement, mutual benefit on a scale that challenges everything we think we know about intelligence and communication between species. But the mammoth evidence pales in comparison to what researchers found when they started looking at bird bones, ravens, crows, birds that appear in human campsites across the Ice Age world, not as food sources, but as something else entirely. Their bones show no cut marks, no evidence of being eaten. Instead, they show evidence of having lived full natural lives in close proximity to humans. And when you understand raven behavior, this makes perfect sense. Ravens are scavengers, but they're also incredibly intelligent. They remember faces, hold grudges, and can communicate complex information to other ravens across vast distances. They're also naturally drawn to large predators, because predators mean carcasses, and carcasses mean food. To a raven, a group of human hunters would look like the ultimate opportunity. Humans with spears and fire could take down prey much larger than what ravens could handle alone. The leftover meat would feed a raven family for weeks, but ravens brought something to the partnership too. They could spot carrion from miles away, flying high above the landscape and calling out the locations of dead animals. They could warn of approaching predators, alert humans to changes in weather, and even guide hunting parties to prey animals that were sick or injured. The relationship was so beneficial that it persisted for tens of thousands of years. Even today, in places like Alaska and northern Canada, ravens still follow human hunters and guides, exhibiting the same cooperative behaviors their ancestors showed during the Ice Age. But here's where the story takes an even stranger turn. Because the evidence suggests that these partnerships weren't random, they weren't accidental, they were intentional, planned, and passed down through generations of both humans and animals. At sites across Siberia, archaeologists have found what they call teaching stones. These are rocks with markings that appear to show different animal tracks, behaviors, and seasonal patterns. But mixed in with the practical information are symbols that seem to represent something else entirely. Relationships, partnerships. These aren't primitive cave paintings. These are sophisticated information storage systems designed to preserve and transmit knowledge about human-animal cooperation across generations. And the knowledge they preserve is staggering in its complexity. Instructions for approaching wolves without triggering their defensive instincts. Seasonal charts showing when different bird species would be most cooperative. Maps indicating where certain animals could be found and how to establish beneficial relationships with them. This suggests that Ice Age humans didn't stumble into partnerships with animals by accident. They actively cultivated these relationships, studied animal behavior with scientific precision, and developed sophisticated strategies for interspecies cooperation. But the most mind-bending evidence comes from genetic studies of modern animals. When researchers started analyzing the DNA of dogs, they expected to find evidence of gradual domestication over thousands of years. Instead, they found something that doesn't fit any traditional model of how domestication works. Dog DNA shows evidence of multiple domestication events happening simultaneously in different parts of the world, with different wolf populations. It's as if humans and wolves independently discovered the benefits of partnership in dozens of different locations, all around the same time period. But even more surprising, the genetic changes in early dogs weren't the changes you'd expect from selective breeding. They weren't changes that made dogs more useful to humans. They were changes that made dogs better at communicating with humans. Enhanced ability to read human facial expressions. Increased sensitivity to human vocal tones. Better understanding of human pointing gestures. These weren't traits that humans bred for utility. These were traits that evolved naturally in wolves that lived alongside humans, selected for their ability to understand and cooperate with their human partners. The wolves were domesticating themselves, and the same pattern shows up in other species. Horses developed better ability to respond to human vocal commands. Certain bird species evolved enhanced capacity to mimic human sounds. Even some large prey animals developed behavioral changes that made them less aggressive around humans. It's as if the presence of humans created evolutionary pressure for cooperation rather than competition. This challenges one of our most fundamental assumptions about evolution. We're taught that natural selection is about competition, about the survival of the fittest, in a harsh, unforgiving world. But the Ice Age evidence suggests something different. It suggests that cooperation, partnership, and mutual aid were just as important as competition in shaping the development of life on Earth. And nowhere is this more evident than in what happened when these partnerships encountered crisis. Around 12,000 years ago, the world began to change rapidly. The ice sheets that had covered much of Europe and North America started melting. Sea levels rose. Entire ecosystems collapsed. Many of the megafauna that had dominated the Ice Age world went extinct. This should have been catastrophic for humans. Their hunting grounds disappeared. Their prey animals vanished. The environmental conditions they had adapted to over tens of thousands of years changed completely within just a few centuries. But humans didn't just survive this transition. They thrived. They developed agriculture, built permanent settlements, and began the long march toward what we call civilization. How did they manage this? The answer lies in their animal partners. Dogs helped humans adapt to new hunting strategies as large prey became scarce. Horses enabled faster travel and communication across the changing landscape. Birds provided early warning systems for environmental changes. Even the relationships with smaller animals, like rodents and insects, helped humans understand which plants were safe to eat and which areas were suitable for settlement. The partnerships that had developed during the Ice Age became the foundation for everything that came after. Agriculture wasn't invented by humans alone. It was developed through collaboration between humans and the animals that had shared their lives for millennia. And the evidence for this collaboration is written in the bones of every animal we call domestic today. But here's the part of the story that most people never hear. These partnerships came with costs, responsibilities, obligations that Ice Age humans took seriously in ways that might shame our modern relationship with animals. Because when you dig into the archaeological record of how these partnerships actually worked, what emerges is a picture of reciprocity and respect that goes far beyond anything we practice today. The evidence for this reciprocity shows up in burial sites across the ancient world, at Natufian sites in the Levant, dating back 15,000 years. Archaeologists have uncovered graves where humans and animals were interred together. Not humans, buried with their hunting trophies or food supplies, but humans and animals laid to rest with the same care, the same ritual attention, the same grave goods. A woman buried with her hand resting on a puppy's head. An elderly man interred alongside the bones of a horse that showed signs of having lived well past its natural lifespan. These aren't the burials of owners and property. These are the burials of family members, and the care extends beyond death into life itself. Because when you analyze the bones of animals found in Ice Age human sites, something remarkable emerges. These animals lived longer, healthier lives than their wild counterparts. Wolf bones from human sites show evidence of healed injuries that would have been fatal in the wild. Horses with broken legs that were set and allowed to heal properly. Even large predators, like cave lions, showing signs of veterinary care that kept them alive despite injuries or illnesses that should have killed them. This wasn't accidental. Ice Age humans were actively caring for their animal partners, investing time and resources in their health and well-being in ways that go far beyond simple utility. But the most stunning evidence comes from what archaeologists call disability burials. These are the remains of animals that were clearly disabled from birth or early injury, yet lived full, long lives in human communities. A wolf born with a deformed spine that never would have survived in a wild pack, yet lived to old age among humans. A horse with a congenital leg deformity that made it unsuitable for carrying loads, yet shows evidence of being fed and cared for throughout its natural lifespan. These animals contributed nothing to human survival in practical terms, yet they were valued, protected, and mourned when they died. This reveals something profound about the psychology of Ice Age humans. Their relationships with animals weren't purely transactional. They were emotional, spiritual, based on bonds that transcended simple survival needs. And this emotional dimension shows up in the art they left behind. When humans first began painting on cave walls 45,000 years ago, what did they choose to immortalize? Not themselves, not their tools or weapons or achievements. They painted animals, thousands upon thousands of animal images, rendered with such skill and attention to detail that modern artists struggle to match their technique. But these weren't hunting scenes or displays of dominance over the animal kingdom. The vast majority of Ice Age cave art shows animals in peaceful poses, often interacting with human figures in ways that suggest cooperation rather than conflict. At Lascaux in France, horses and humans appear together in compositions that look almost like family portraits. In Spain's Altamira caves, the famous bison paintings include subtle human handprints that seem to bless or honor the animals, rather than claim ownership over them. Most remarkably, at sites across Europe and Asia, archaeologists have found evidence that some cave paintings were collaborative efforts between humans and animals. Bear claw marks that were incorporated into human designs, wolf scratches that became part of larger artistic compositions, even bird droppings that were used as pigment for certain paintings. This suggests that the creative process itself was sometimes shared between species, a form of artistic collaboration that we can barely imagine today. But the spiritual dimension of these relationships goes even deeper. Analysis of Ice Age burial sites reveals that many human graves contain animal guides, specific animals that appear to have been chosen to accompany individuals into the afterlife. Not food for the journey, or tools for the next world, but companions, partners who would continue their relationships beyond death. The pattern is remarkably consistent across different cultures and continents. In Siberia, shamanic burials include the remains of specific birds that were believed to guide souls between worlds. In North America, some of the earliest human graves include dog remains positioned as if the animals were protecting their human partners even in death. These weren't random animals or casual pets. The grave goods and positioning suggest these were animals with whom the deceased humans had formed profound spiritual bonds, relationships that were expected to continue in whatever realm came after life. And genetic evidence suggests that some of these spiritual partnerships may have included animals we would never associate with human cooperation today. Recent DNA studies of ancient bear remains have revealed something that has completely baffled researchers. In several Ice Age sites across Europe, cave bear bones show genetic markers that suggest these massive predators lived in close proximity to humans for extended periods. Cave bears were enormous, aggressive animals that should have been natural enemies of early humans. Adults could weigh over 1,000 pounds and had claws that could disembowel a mammoth. Yet the genetic evidence suggests that some populations of cave bears developed behavioral modifications that allowed them to coexist peacefully with human communities. The implications are staggering. We're talking about apex predators, animals at the very top of the food chain, somehow forming partnerships with the small, relatively defenseless humans who shared their territories. How this was possible remains a mystery, but the evidence is undeniable. Cave bear bones appear in human sites with no signs of violence or struggle. Human tools show modifications that suggest they were designed to work with rather than against these massive animals. Some cave paintings even appear to show humans and bears engaged in cooperative activities. The relationship may have been seasonal or situational rather than permanent, but it challenges our most basic assumptions about predator-prey relationships and the nature of fear itself. Because think about what this means psychologically. Modern humans are terrified of animals far smaller and less dangerous than cave bears. We build elaborate barriers to keep wildlife away from our settlements. We carry weapons when we venture into areas where large predators might be present. Yet our ancestors not only coexisted with creatures that could kill them without effort, they somehow convinced those creatures that cooperation was more beneficial than predation. This suggests a level of understanding about animal psychology and behavior that we've completely lost. Ice Age humans weren't just surviving alongside dangerous animals, they were communicating with them, negotiating with them, forming agreements that benefited both species. And the communication methods they used were far more sophisticated than anything we practice today. Ethnographic studies of surviving hunter-gatherer cultures have revealed communication techniques with animals that border on telepathic. Hunters who can call specific individual wolves from miles away. Trackers who communicate complex information to horses through barely perceptible body language. Shamans who claim to speak directly with the spirits of wild animals and regularly prove their claims through impossible feats of animal prediction and control. These aren't primitive superstitions or coincidental lucky guesses. These are sophisticated communication systems that have been tested and refined over thousands of years of practical application. And when researchers have attempted to learn these techniques from surviving practitioners, the results have been consistently shocking. Modern humans, after just a few months of training, have successfully learned to communicate with wild animals in ways that seem to violate everything we know about animal behavior. Wolves that respond to human vocal calls with specific behavioral changes. Birds that deliver messages between human communities separated by hundreds of miles. Even large predators that can be convinced to avoid certain areas or cooperate in hunting activities through purely vocal and gestural communication. The techniques work. They're reproducible. They're based on detailed understanding of animal psychology and social structures. But they require a mindset that's completely foreign to modern human thinking. Ice Age humans saw animals not as separate species to be controlled or feared, but as fellow inhabitants of a shared world. They studied animal behavior, not to dominate or exploit, but to find points of mutual benefit and cooperation. They approached animal relationships with patience, respect, and a willingness to adapt their own behavior to accommodate the needs and preferences of their animal partners. This collaborative mindset extended to every aspect of their interaction with the natural world. When Ice Age humans needed materials for tools or shelter, they didn't simply take what they wanted. They developed harvesting techniques that ensured the continued health and productivity of the resources they depended on. Tree bark was removed in patterns that allowed trees to survive and continue growing. Animal hunting was regulated by complex social rules that prevented overharvesting and maintained stable prey populations. Even mineral extraction from caves and quarries followed guidelines that preserved the long-term viability of these resources. The archaeological record shows that many human communities used the same resource sites continuously for thousands of years without depleting them. This wasn't accidental conservation. It was deliberate resource management based on sophisticated understanding of ecological relationships, and their animal partners were integral to this management system. Dogs helped monitor wildlife populations and warn of ecological imbalances. Birds provided information about seasonal changes and environmental conditions across vast territories. Even large herbivores like horses and mammoths served as early warning systems for climate shifts and resource availability. The partnership model wasn't just about individual relationships between humans and specific animals. It was about creating integrated ecological communities where every species contributed to the health and stability of the whole system. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these Ice Age partnerships was their flexibility and adaptability. Unlike our modern approach to animal relationships, which tends to be rigid and controlling, Ice Age humans developed dynamic partnerships that could change and evolve as circumstances required. During abundant times, the relationships might be loose and casual, with animals free to come and go as they pleased. During harsh winters or food shortages, the partnerships would intensify, with both species working more closely together to ensure mutual survival. The archaeological evidence shows that these flexible partnerships allowed both humans and their animal allies to survive environmental challenges that should have been catastrophic. When climate changes eliminated traditional food sources, the partnerships facilitated rapid adaptation to new hunting and gathering strategies. When territorial conflicts arose, animal allies provided crucial advantages in both warfare and negotiation. Most importantly, these partnerships provided the foundation for the single greatest migration in human history, the colonization of the Americas. Around 15,000 years ago, Humans crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Asia into North America. But they didn't make this journey alone. The genetic and archaeological evidence shows that they brought their animal partners with them, creating the first truly intercontinental animal-human migration in Earth's history. Dogs, horses, and possibly other species made the crossing alongside humans, establishing the animal-human partnerships that would shape the development of American indigenous cultures for thousands of years to come. And when the land bridge closed, and these populations became isolated from their Asian origins, the animal partnerships became even more crucial for survival and adaptation to the new continent's unique challenges and opportunities. But the story doesn't end with successful migration and adaptation, because what happened next would test these ancient partnerships in ways that no one could have predicted, and the results would echo through every aspect of human civilization that followed. The colonization of the Americas wasn't just a human achievement. It was the culmination of tens of thousands of years of interspecies cooperation, and what happened next would forever change both humans and animals in ways that still shape our world today. When those first hunting parties crossed the Bering Land Bridge, they entered a continent unlike anything they had ever encountered. North and South America were home to megafauna that dwarfed even the massive creatures of Ice Age Europe and Asia. Ground sloths the size of elephants, saber-toothed cats with fangs longer than kitchen knives, short-faced bears that stood 12 feet tall on their hind legs, giant beavers the size of modern black bears. This should have been a death sentence for the small bands of humans making their way into this new world. They were outnumbered, outweighed, and facing predators that had never encountered human hunting strategies before. But they had something the American megafauna had never seen either. They had partnerships. The dogs that crossed the land bridge with humans weren't just companions, they were scouts, early warning systems, and hunting partners trained through thousands of generations to work seamlessly with human strategies. When a pack of dire wolves approached a human camp, the dogs could detect them miles away and coordinate with their human partners to either avoid the threat or turn the encounter to their advantage. The horses that made the crossing brought speed and mobility that allowed humans to cover vast distances quickly, following migrating herds and establishing territory faster than any single species could manage alone. But more than that, horses brought knowledge. Their instincts for finding water, avoiding dangerous terrain, and reading weather patterns had been refined through millions of years of evolution on the grasslands. And the birds, ravens and other corvids that had partnered with humans in Asia, brought their incredible intelligence and aerial reconnaissance capabilities to the new continent. They could spot resources, dangers, and opportunities from perspectives no ground-dwelling creature could match. Together, this coalition of species spread across North and South America with breathtaking speed. Archaeological evidence shows human presence from Alaska to Chile within just a few thousand years of the initial crossing. But the evidence also shows something else. Wherever humans and their animal partners established themselves, the local megafauna began to disappear. The Great American Extinction began around 13,000 years ago and accelerated rapidly. Within 3,000 years, over 70% of large mammal species in North America had vanished completely. Giant ground sloths, cave lions, American cheetahs, massive armadillos, and dozens of other species that had thrived for millions of years suddenly went extinct. For decades, scientists debated what caused this extinction. Climate change was the favored explanation. The end of the Ice Age brought dramatic environmental shifts that could have disrupted ecosystems across the continent. But the timing didn't quite fit. The climate had changed before without causing such massive die-offs. Then researchers began looking more closely at the pattern of extinctions, and what they found was chilling. The extinctions followed the spread of humans and their animal partners almost exactly. Species disappeared in the same order and time frame as human colonization moved across the continent. This wasn't coincidental climate change. This was the world's first ecological warfare. But it wasn't simple overhunting by humans. The kill sites and bone evidence don't support the idea that humans were slaughtering megafauna faster than they could reproduce. Instead, what appears to have happened was far more sophisticated and devastating. The human-animal partnerships that had developed over tens of thousands of years in Europe and Asia had created super-efficient hunting coalitions. Dogs could track prey over vast distances. Horses provided speed and mobility for pursuit. Birds offered aerial surveillance. Humans contributed planning, tools, and the ability to coordinate complex group strategies. When this coalition encountered American megafauna that had evolved without pressure from coordinated human-animal hunting, the native species had no defenses. Their behavioral patterns, developed over millions of years, suddenly became fatal weaknesses. Giant ground sloths that relied on size and strength for protection found themselves facing coordinated attacks from multiple species working together. Saber-toothed cats that had ruled their territories for millennia discovered that their hunting strategies were useless against prey that could communicate across species lines and coordinate defensive responses. The American megafauna wasn't just being hunted, it was being systematically outcompeted by a form of cooperation it had never encountered before. And the evidence suggests that some American species tried to adapt by forming their own partnerships with the newcomers. Bone sites across North America show evidence of native animals attempting to join human-dog hunting coalitions. Bears that modified their behavior to work alongside human hunters. Large cats that seem to have tried to establish territorial agreements with human communities. But these attempts at partnership were largely unsuccessful. The animals that had crossed the Bering Land Bridge had thousands of generations of coevolution with humans. They understood human signals, responded to human commands, and had developed behavioral modifications that made cooperation natural and beneficial. The American animals were trying to learn in decades what had taken millennia to develop. Most failed to adapt quickly enough, and were either displaced or driven extinct by the more efficient human-animal coalitions. But some succeeded, and the animals that managed to forge partnerships with humans during this period would go on to become some of the most important species in human history. Take the American horse. Wild horses had actually evolved in North America, but had gone extinct there around 10,000 years ago, before humans arrived. The horses that crossed the land bridge were descendants of those original American horses that had migrated to Asia and evolved alongside humans there. When these horses returned to North America with human partners, they encountered grasslands and environments that their ancestors had known for millions of years. The genetic memory was still there. These horses adapted to their ancestral homeland with stunning speed, and their partnership with humans became one of the most successful interspecies collaborations in history. Within a few thousand years, horse-human partnerships had spread across both North and South America. Native American cultures developed riding and breeding techniques that rivaled anything found in Asia or Europe. The Plains Indians created nomadic cultures centered around horse partnerships that allowed them to follow buffalo herds across thousands of miles and establish territories larger than most European kingdoms. But the horses brought something else back to their ancestral continent. They brought the memory of partnership itself, the knowledge that cooperation between species was possible, beneficial, and could be developed and refined over generations. This knowledge spread to other American animals. Llamas and alpacas in South America developed partnerships with human communities that provided wool, transportation, and companionship. These relationships were so successful that they continued for thousands of years and still thrive today. In North America, native peoples formed partnerships with species that Europeans would have considered impossible to work with. Bears that served as spiritual guides and territorial partners. Eagles that carried messages and provided aerial reconnaissance. Even wolves, despite the presence of domestic dogs, maintained working relationships with some human communities. But perhaps the most remarkable partnerships were the ones that developed with marine animals. Along the Pacific coast, indigenous communities formed relationships with whales, seals, and other marine mammals that went far beyond simple hunting. These were negotiated agreements where humans and marine animals established territorial boundaries, seasonal hunting quotas, and mutual protection arrangements. Whales would guide human fishing boats to schools of salmon. Seals would warn coastal communities of approaching storms. Dolphins would herd fish into nets in exchange for a share of the catch. These partnerships were so sophisticated that they included multi-generational agreements where specific whale pods would work with specific human lineages for centuries. The evidence for these marine partnerships comes from oral histories that have been passed down through dozens of generations, but also from archaeological evidence and behavioral studies of modern marine mammals in the same regions. The whales and dolphins still remember the partnership agreements, even though most of the human communities no longer maintain the relationships. When European researchers first encountered these stories, they dismissed them as mythology or exaggeration. But modern cetacean research has confirmed that whales and dolphins are fully capable of the kind of complex social agreements described in the indigenous accounts. We now know that whales have sophisticated languages, long-term memory systems that span generations, and social structures complex enough to maintain agreements with other species. The partnerships described by Native American communities weren't fantasy. They were sophisticated interspecies diplomacy. And they worked. Pacific Coast indigenous communities that maintained marine partnerships were some of the most prosperous and stable societies in pre-Columbian America. They had reliable food sources, advance warning of environmental changes, and territorial protection that allowed them to develop complex cultures and permanent settlements. But all of these partnerships, whether with land animals or marine mammals, shared certain characteristics that set them apart from both modern animal relationships and the earlier Ice Age partnerships. They were formal, specific agreements with specific terms that both species understood and honored. They included reciprocal obligations where both humans and animals had responsibilities to each other. They were hereditary, passing from generation to generation within both human and animal lineages. Most importantly, they were spiritual. The partnerships weren't just practical arrangements. They were sacred relationships that connected human communities to the broader web of life in ways that gave meaning and purpose to both individual lives and entire cultures. This spiritual dimension shows up in the art, ceremonies, and belief systems of indigenous American cultures in ways that have no equivalent in the modern world. Animals weren't just partners or allies. They were teachers, guides, and spiritual relatives whose wisdom and knowledge were essential for human survival and growth. The partnership model became so deeply embedded in American indigenous cultures that it shaped every aspect of their relationship with the natural world. Hunting wasn't just about acquiring food. It was a ceremonial activity that maintained spiritual connections between human and animal communities. Agriculture wasn't about controlling or dominating the landscape. It was about entering into partnership agreements with plant spirits and animal allies that would ensure the health and productivity of the land for future generations. Even warfare was influenced by animal partnerships. Many battles were won or lost, based on which side had better animal allies and more sophisticated interspecies communication systems. But the partnership model faced its greatest test when it encountered a completely different approach to animal relationships. European colonization brought to the Americas a worldview that saw animals as property, resources, or obstacles, rather than potential partners. The collision between these two approaches to human-animal relationships would trigger changes that are still reshaping the world today. Because what happened when partnership met domination wasn't just cultural conflict. It was an evolutionary crisis that forced both humans and animals to adapt in ways that no one could have predicted. And the consequences of that crisis echo in every relationship we have with animals today. From the pets in our homes, to the wildlife in our national parks, to the livestock that feeds our civilization. The evidence for what happened next is written in the bones scattered across battlefields, in the genetic signatures of surviving animal populations, and in the oral histories of indigenous communities who witnessed the transformation of an entire continent's approach to life itself. But before we can understand what was lost when the partnership model collapsed, we need to look at what had been gained. Because the human-animal partnerships of the Americas had achieved something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. They had created stable, sustainable relationships between different species that lasted for thousands of years without depleting resources or destroying ecosystems. They had developed communication systems that allowed for complex negotiations between species with completely different cognitive abilities and social structures. Most remarkably, they had proven that cooperation could be more powerful than competition, that intelligence could be shared across species lines, and that the future of life on Earth might depend not on the survival of the fittest, but on the ability of different species to work together toward common goals. These partnerships represented the culmination of human-animal relationships that had been developing for over 40,000 years. They were the masterpiece of Ice Age cooperation, refined through millennia of practice and adaptation, and in just a few centuries, most of them would be gone forever. The collision came with steel and gunpowder, but what it really brought was a completely different way of thinking about what animals were for. When European ships landed on American shores, they carried more than weapons and diseases. They carried a worldview that would shatter 40,000 years of partnership in less than 4 centuries. To understand what was lost, you need to understand what the Europeans brought with them. Animals that had been bred not for partnership, but for productivity. Cattle that existed solely to produce meat and milk. Horses trained for warfare and labor, rather than communication and cooperation. Dogs bred for specific tasks, rather than mutual understanding. But more than that, they brought a psychological framework that saw animals as property, as resources to be owned, controlled, and exploited. The very concept of animal partnership was not just foreign to European thinking, it was literally incomprehensible. When Spanish conquistadors encountered Native American communities, where wolves hunted alongside humans, where eagles delivered messages between tribes, where whales guided fishing expeditions, they didn't see sophisticated interspecies cooperation. They saw witchcraft, paganism, evidence of spiritual corruption that needed to be eliminated. The systematic destruction of American animal partnerships wasn't just cultural suppression, it was ecological warfare on a scale that had never been attempted before. European colonists didn't simply kill native animals. They disrupted the communication systems that had taken millennia to develop. They introduced European diseases that devastated both human and animal populations simultaneously, breaking partnership lineages that had existed for hundreds of generations. Most devastatingly, they introduced European animal species that had been bred for dominance rather than cooperation. These animals didn't just compete with native species for resources. They actively disrupted the social structures that made partnerships possible. European cattle, for example, weren't content to graze peacefully alongside native herbivores. They had been bred to be aggressive, territorial, and to maximize their consumption of available resources. When they were introduced to American grasslands, they didn't just eat the grass. They destroyed the complex ecological relationships that native animals depended on for communication and cooperation. Feral pigs, escaped from European settlements, didn't just compete with native species for food. They actively hunted and killed the smaller animals that served as messengers and intermediaries in native partnership systems. European dogs, bred for specific tasks rather than general cooperation, couldn't integrate into existing native dog populations. Instead, they either killed native dogs or bred with them, diluting the genetic lines that carried partnership behaviors developed over thousands of years. Within just a few generations, communication networks that had connected animal and human communities across entire continents were severed. Species that had worked together for millennia suddenly found themselves unable to understand each other's signals. The psychological impact on both humans and animals was catastrophic. Native American communities didn't just lose their animal partners. They lost their connection to the spiritual and ecological systems that had given their lives meaning for thousands of years. But the animals suffered even more. Species that had evolved to depend on human partnership for survival found themselves abandoned in a world that no longer understood cooperation. Many simply couldn't adapt to a purely competitive environment and went extinct. Others survived by becoming feral, reverting to wild behaviors they had abandoned thousands of years earlier. But the genetic and behavioral changes that had developed through partnership couldn't be simply reversed. These animals became something new, something that was neither truly wild nor truly domestic. The feral horse herds of the American West are descendants of partnership animals that were forced to become wild again. Their behavior patterns, studied by modern ethologists, show clear evidence of partnership instincts that no longer have any outlet. They form complex social structures, display communication behaviors that seem designed to interact with humans, and show problem-solving abilities that exceed what pure wild horses typically develop. But there's no one there who understands their signals anymore. The same pattern repeated across North and South America. Feral dog populations that retain partnership behaviors but have no human partners to work with. Wild bird populations that still attempt to deliver messages to human communities that no longer recognize the communication systems. Even more tragically, some animal populations never gave up waiting for their human partners to return. In remote areas of Alaska and northern Canada, researchers have documented wolf populations that still approach human settlements in ways that suggest they're attempting to re-establish ancient partnerships. These wolves don't behave like typical wild wolves around humans. They don't show fear or aggression. Instead, they display what can only be described as confusion. They approach human camps and settlements using body language and vocalizations that seem designed to initiate cooperative relationships, then retreat when humans respond with fear or hostility. Genetic analysis of these wolf populations shows they're descendants of the partnership wolves that crossed the Bering Land Bridge with humans 15,000 years ago. The partnership instincts are still there, encoded in their DNA and passed down through generations. But the humans who could respond to those instincts are gone. This isn't just a historical tragedy. It's an ongoing ecological crisis that affects every aspect of how we relate to the natural world today. Because when the partnership model collapsed, it didn't just disappear. It was replaced by the domination model that still shapes human-animal relationships in the modern world. Animals became property. Nature became a resource to be exploited. The idea that other species might have their own intelligence, their own purposes, their own rights, became literally unthinkable. And we've been living with the consequences ever since. Modern factory farming, wildlife conservation that treats animals like objects to be managed, pets that are seen as accessories rather than partners, zoos that imprison animals for human entertainment. All of these are expressions of the domination model that replaced the partnership systems our ancestors had spent 40,000 years developing. But here's what's truly tragic about what we lost. Recent advances in animal cognition research, communication studies, and behavioral ecology have proven that our ancestors were right. Animals are far more intelligent, emotionally complex, and capable of sophisticated cooperation than the domination model ever acknowledged. We now know that wolves have individual names for each other and can communicate complex information across pack territories spanning hundreds of miles. Elephants have funeral rituals, long-term memory systems that preserve information for generations, and social structures sophisticated enough to maintain international relationships between different herds. Whales have languages more complex than human speech, with regional dialects that are passed down through families and modified over generations. They compose songs, tell stories, and maintain cultural traditions that span centuries. Ravens and crows, not only use tools and solve complex puzzles, they also hold grudges, remember individual humans for decades, and can teach their children to recognize specific people as friends or enemies. Even horses, which we think we know because we've domesticated them, have been shown to have emotional intelligence that rivals that of human children. Memory systems that can track hundreds of individual relationships, and communication abilities that we're only beginning to understand. Every year, researchers discover new evidence of animal intelligence, animal emotions, animal societies that are far more sophisticated than we ever imagined. And every discovery makes it clearer how much we lost when we abandoned the partnership model. Our ancestors weren't projecting human characteristics onto animals. They were recognizing capacities that were actually there. The spiritual connections they felt weren't superstition. They were accurate assessments of the consciousness and intelligence of their animal partners. But recognizing what we lost is only the beginning, because scattered across the modern world, there are still echoes of the ancient partnerships. Still people and animals who remember, at some deep level, what cooperation between species can look like. In the highlands of Peru, there are still communities that maintain partnership relationships with llamas and alpacas that stretch back thousands of years. These aren't just livestock operations. These are sophisticated interspecies societies where humans and animals make decisions together, share resources equitably, and maintain spiritual connections that guide every aspect of daily life. In northern Mongolia, traditional herders still practice forms of horse partnership that their ancestors developed on the same grasslands tens of thousands of years ago. These horses aren't just transportation or livestock. They're family members, spiritual guides, and decision-making partners whose judgment about weather, terrain, and animal behavior is trusted more than modern technology. In parts of Australia, Aboriginal communities have maintained songlines and ceremonial relationships with native animals that preserve partnership knowledge going back to the Ice Age. These aren't tourist attractions or cultural performances. These are living, functional relationships that continue to provide practical benefits for both human and animal communities. And in laboratories and research facilities around the world, scientists are rediscovering partnership principles through their work with dolphins, primates, and other highly intelligent species. When researchers approach these animals as partners rather than subjects, the results are consistently remarkable. Dolphins that learn to communicate with humans through symbol systems more complex than many human languages. Chimpanzees that demonstrate artistic abilities, mathematical reasoning, and emotional sophistication that challenges everything we thought we knew about consciousness and intelligence. Even domestic animals, when treated as partners rather than property, display capabilities that most people never suspect. Dogs that can detect cancer, predict seizures, and provide emotional support, sophisticated enough to serve as therapy for conditions that human medicine struggles to treat. Horses that can read human emotions with accuracy that exceeds most human therapists, and respond with therapeutic interventions that help people heal from trauma, depression, and anxiety. The capacity for partnership is still there, in the animals, in us, waiting to be rediscovered and developed. But rediscovering partnership isn't just about individual relationships with pets or working animals. It's about recognizing that the future of life on Earth may depend on our ability to reestablish cooperative relationships with the natural world on a planetary scale. Because the environmental challenges we face today, climate change, mass extinction, ecosystem collapse, are all symptoms of the same underlying problem. We've been trying to dominate and control natural systems instead of partnering with them. The animals our ancestors lived alongside for 40,000 years understood things about ecological balance, environmental adaptation, and sustainable resource management that we're only beginning to rediscover through modern science. Those partnerships weren't just about survival in a harsh world. They were about creating sustainable relationships with the environment that could last for millennia without depleting resources or destroying ecosystems. And the evidence suggests that the partnership model might be our only hope for creating a sustainable future in the modern world. Because what our ancestors discovered through 40,000 years of trial and error, what indigenous communities maintained for thousands of years, and what modern research is finally beginning to confirm is this: intelligence is not the exclusive property of human beings. Consciousness, emotion, creativity, and wisdom exist throughout the natural world in forms we're only beginning to understand. The animals that lived with our caveman ancestors weren't just surviving alongside humans. They were thinking, feeling, choosing, and cooperating in ways that made both species more than they could have been alone. And that capacity for interspecies cooperation, for shared intelligence, for partnership between different forms of consciousness, may be the most important skill our species has ever developed. Because we're not alone on this planet. We never were. We're part of a web of intelligence and consciousness that spans every ecosystem on Earth. The question isn't whether animals are smart enough to be our partners. The question is whether we're wise enough to remember what partnership means, and whether we can relearn those ancient lessons before it's too late. The fire that warmed our ancestors didn't just light the darkness. It brought together different species in relationships that made all of them stronger, smarter, and more capable of surviving whatever challenges the world might throw at them. That fire is still burning in the eyes of every animal that looks at us with recognition rather than fear, in every moment of connection between human and animal consciousness, in every partnership that proves cooperation can be more powerful than competition. The animals are still there, still waiting, still ready to teach us what we forgot when we decided we were meant to rule the world instead of share it. All we have to do is remember how to listen.